The first time a stranger's hand rested on my belly without asking, I understood the child inside me already belonged to more people than just me. Her name was Fanny. She was the one they sent. She sat close, her chair scraping the plank floor until our knees nearly touched, and she smelled of dried mint and wood smoke. I felt the baby turn. I felt my own breath go small. And then Fanny smiled the way you smile at someone who does not yet know what is coming. And she said there was a promise every new mother must give before her time. She would not tell me what it was. Not yet. My name is Sadi. I grew up in a small settlement tucked in the folds of Fentress County, Tennessee. And I was 22 the winter I stopped saying the words they wanted me to say. This channel is where I tell the quiet things. The ones we were taught to fold up and put away. The ones no one warns you about until they are already inside your house. If any part of my story reaches something in you, I hope you'll subscribe and stay a while. This is a place to belong, not a place to be fixed. Before I go on, I want to ask you something, and I mean it plainly. Was there ever a moment when someone asked you to agree to something before you were allowed to know what it was? Tell me below. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to that room, and that hand, and the promise I would not give. I did not tell anyone the day I first felt her move. It was early, a flutter low and strange, like a moth caught behind glass. And I stood at the clothesline with a wet shirt in my hands, and simply stopped. I was young. I had been married 1 year and 2 months, and I still thought of my body as my own. The way you think of a room you have not yet learned is rented. The baby moved again. I pressed my palm flat against the cloth of my dress, and for one clean moment, before anyone else knew, she was only mine. That did not last. In our settlement, news of a coming child travels faster than the child does. Within a week, the women's eyes had changed when they landed on me. Before, they had looked at me kindly enough, the youngest wife, still clumsy with the canning, still learning to keep a house the way it ought to be kept. Now they looked at me the way you look at a field before harvest, measuring, calculating what it owed. Their warmth had a new edge underneath it, a watchfulness. I could not name it then. I only knew that being seen had started to feel like being counted. My husband, Levi, was proud in the shy way of a man who did not have many words. He would rest his hand on the back of my chair at supper and say nothing, and I knew that was his way of saying everything. I loved him. I want you to hear that plainly, because what came later was never his doing alone. He was a good man raised inside a hard system, and he believed the things he had been given to believe, the same way he believed the sun would rise. When the older women began to speak of preparing me, he only nodded, relieved, as if a weight were being lifted from his hands and set gently onto mine. The word prepared sat wrong with me from the start. I had thought birth was a thing your body did and your neighbors helped with, the way they helped with a barn or a harvest. But prepared sounded like something else. It sounded like a door I would be walked through, whether or not I wished to go. I asked Levi what there was to prepare. He looked at me for a long moment, and something passed over his face that I would only understand much later. He said the women would tell me when it was time. He said it kindly, but he did not meet my eyes. Then came the afternoon Fanny was sent. She was not the oldest woman in the church, but she was the one the mothers went to, the one who sat at the head of every birthing and knew things the men did not ask about. She came without a basket, which I noticed, because women here did not visit empty-handed. She came only with herself, and that told me this was not a social call. She settled into the chair across from me and drew it closer, wood scraping wood, until the space between us was gone. Outside, a dog barked once and went quiet. Fanny put her hand on my belly. She did not ask. Her fingers were warm and dry, and I felt my own body go still beneath them, the way a rabbit goes still. She spoke softly about what a mother owes. She said a good mother gives her yes before the pain ever comes, that the giving is the beginning of the love. I did not understand her. I thought she meant the ordinary yes of motherhood, the sleepless nights, the endless work. I nodded, because nodding was what I knew how to do, and Fanny watched me nod, and something in her face said she knew I did not yet understand at all. I asked her, carefully, what the promise was, what words I would need to say. She smiled and told me it was not spoken until a woman's time was near, that the promise had its season like everything else, and that I was not ready to hear it yet. She said this as though she were being gentle, but there is a particular fear that comes from being told you have already agreed to something you have not been allowed to read. That night I lay awake with my hand on my belly, and I counted the women I knew, every mother in that valley, and I understood that each of them had once sat in a chair like mine, and each of them had said the words. Not one of them had ever told me what the words were. That was the thing that kept me up long after Levi's breathing had gone slow and even beside me. It was not that a promise existed. Our whole life was made of promises, to God, to the church, to one another. It was the silence around this one. It was the way even the kindest women closed their faces when the subject came near. The way my own mother had never once mentioned it in all the years she taught me to be a wife. A secret kept by everyone at once is not a secret. It is a wall. And I was beginning to feel, in the dark, exactly how tall that wall had been built, and how long ago, and how many hands had raised it before mine. After that night I began to watch the mothers the way Fanny had watched me. I could not help it. I would stand at the edge of a gathering, a plate going cold in my hands, and study their faces for the place where the thing they had given up used to be. I do not know what I expected to find. A scar, maybe, some mark left behind. But there was nothing so plain as that. There was only a kind of smoothness, a settledness, the look of water after the stone has already sunk. They had all gone quiet in the same particular way, and I had never noticed it until I had reason to. Then, at the turning of the season, a woman 2 farms over came to her time. Her name was Barbara, and she was not much older than me. The house filled with women, as it always did, and I was sent to help carry water and keep the little ones fed. I was not allowed near the room itself, being unproven, but I heard enough through the wall. What I remember is not the sounds of the labor. What I remember is the silence after, how the house went still, and how Barbara, when they finally let me bring in the broth, lay there with her new son and asked for nothing, nothing at all, not water, not rest, not a soul to sit with her. I set the bowl down beside her and waited, the way you wait to be thanked. She only looked at me with a face wiped clean of wanting, and she said, so quietly I almost missed it, that God had been good and she had made no trouble. Made no trouble. The words followed me home down the frozen ruts of the lane. All around me the older women were praising her, saying she had done beautifully, that she had been strong, that she had not once called out for what she should not have. And I understood, slowly, the way cold gets into a house, one seam at a time, that the praise was not for the child. The praise was for the silence. I started then to gather the shape of it, not the words yet, but the shape. The promise was about surrender. It was about taking whatever came in that room and taking it without protest, without asking for the doctor in town, without crying out for anything that might reach past the walls of the settlement. A woman who bore it silently was a woman of great faith. A woman who did not was something else. And I began to hear how they spoke of those others, the ones who had broken. They did not say it unkindly. That was the worst of it. They said it with pity, the way you speak of someone who has caught a sickness of the spirit. They called it trust. Trust in God, trust in His plan for the pain of women, which was old as the garden and just as final. But I had begun to see that trust and control can wear the very same dress. What was asked of us was not faith in God. God was not in that chair scraping toward me. God had not laid a hand on my belly without asking. It was the church that asked, and the men who led it, and the women who had already paid and could not bear to watch a younger one refuse the price they themselves had given. The doctrine was real, but underneath the doctrine was something older and plainer, and it was about who gets to make a sound and who does not. I could not reconcile it, and that failure frightened me more than anything. I loved my faith. I want you to understand that. It was the water I swam in. It was the ground under my feet. I had never once wished to leave it. But I could not make my heart agree that God wanted me to promise away my own voice before I even knew what I would suffer. To pre-forgive a pain I had not yet felt. To sign my name, in silence, to whatever came. Every time I tried to fold myself around that idea, something in me went rigid and would not bend. And I did not know yet whether that thing was pride or sin, or the only true part of me left. There was one woman who gave me something to hold. Her name was Verna, old enough that her hands shook when she poured, and she had buried a husband and outlived most of her friends. One evening, drying dishes beside me, she said a strange thing, almost to herself. She said the promise had not always been so heavy. She said that in her mother's time, it had been a gentler thing, a blessing more than a binding, and that somewhere along the years, it had hardened into what it now was. Then she looked at me sharp, as if she had said too much, and she would say no more. But she had opened a door. Somebody had made it this way, which meant somebody, once, could unmake it. I carried Verna's words like a coal cupped in my hands. My body was heavy now, low and full, and I could feel my time coming the way you feel weather change before the sky does. And then, on an ordinary gray morning, Fanny came again. She stood in my doorway with the cold behind her, and she told me the women would gather within the week to hear my promise, that my season had come at last. She said it as a kindness, as good news. But I stood there with my hands on the great weight of my belly, and I knew, with a certainty that scared me, exactly what I would be asked. And I knew I did not want to say yes. They gathered on a Thursday, in Fanny's front room, with the shades half drawn against the winter glare. There were 7 of them, the mothers of the settlement, women I had known my whole life. They sat in a loose ring of chairs, and they left one chair open in the middle, and that chair was for me. I lowered myself into it slowly, both hands beneath my belly, and I felt every eye settle on me at once. Someone had baked, and the smell of it hung in the warm air, sweet and out of place. My mouth had gone dry, my heart was a fist against my ribs, and still I did not yet know the exact words they wanted, only that they were coming. Fanny began. She spoke of the garden, and the curse laid on women there, of pain as the doorway every mother must pass through, of how a faithful woman does not fight the doorway, but walks through it with her head bowed. Then she leaned toward me, and her voice went low and even, and at last she gave me the words I had waited months to hear. I was to promise to bear my labor in silence, to ask for no doctor, no comfort, no help from beyond the settlement, no matter what came, to give my body's every decision, in that room, over to my husband and to the church, to say my yes now, before the pain, so that when it came, I would have nothing left to take back. The room waited. That is the part I still feel in my sleep, the waiting. 7 women leaning in the half-light, and the whole weight of the valley behind them, and every mother before them going back and back to the first one who ever sat in that middle chair. All I had to do was say one small word. It was such a little word. It would have cost me nothing that anyone could see, and it would have brought me back into their warmth in an instant. I opened my mouth, and what came out was not the word they wanted. I said no. I said it quietly, almost gently, the way you set down something fragile. I said I could not promise my silence about a pain I had not yet met. I said I did not know what was coming, and I would not sign my name to it in the dark. My voice did not shake. That surprised me more than anything, that in the moment I had dreaded for months my voice came out level and low and completely my own. And then the silence in that room changed. It stopped being the silence of waiting and became something colder, a held breath that did not let go. I have never seen faces close so fast. Fanny's went smooth as a shut door. The others looked down at their hands, at the floor, anywhere but at me. One of them made a small sound, a soft intake of air, as if I had said something obscene. And in a way, to them, I had. A woman refusing was one thing, but a woman with child refusing, a woman about to need them, about to lie helpless in a room they would fill, that was not defiance. That was madness. That was a mother willing to risk her own baby out of pride, and I could see them arranging me into that shape even as I sat there, turning me from Sadi into a cautionary tale. Word reached Levi before I even got home. He was standing in the kitchen when I came in, and his face held something I had never seen on it before. Not anger, but a deep and frightened shame. The shame of a man whose wife has done a thing the whole valley will now know about. He asked me, quietly, if it was true. I said it was. He asked me why I would endanger our child, our standing, my own soul, over a few words that every good woman had said before me. And I understood, standing there in my own kitchen, that he truly could not see it any other way. To him I was not protecting myself. I was throwing something precious off a cliff. And he could not follow me to the place where I was standing. I was afraid. I will not pretend I was brave and steady all through. That night I shook in our bed, and I wept as quietly as I could, and part of me screamed that I should go back to Fanny in the morning and say the word and end it. It would be so easy. But underneath the fear was a thing harder than fear, something that had gone rigid in me the first day Fanny's hand touched my belly without asking, and it would not lie back down. I could be afraid and certain at the very same time. I had not known that before. I know it now. There was one small thing I held on to through those long days, when no one came to visit, and the warmth of the whole valley had turned its back. At the gathering, in the moment after I said no, one of the younger mothers, a woman named Esther, only a few years older than me, had lifted her head. Just for an instant, she had looked at me, and I saw something move behind her eyes, something that wanted to speak. Her lips had parted, and then Fanny had shifted in her chair, and Esther had looked back down at her hands and said nothing at all. But I had seen it, and I carried it with me into the days ahead, when my time came at last, and I faced the one room I had been most afraid of, as the woman who broke the promise, with no one bound to help me. My time came on a night of hard rain, the kind that turns the lane to a river and shuts the world down to the walls of your own house. The pain started low and long after dark, and Levi went out into the storm to fetch the women, because that is what you do, promise or no promise. I lay in that room and I listened to the rain on the roof, and I was more afraid of the women coming than I was of the pain itself. I had refused them. I did not know if they would fill that room with warmth or with cold. I did not know if a woman who broke the promise would be left to labor alone as her punishment. They came. Of course they came. The settlement does not let a woman labor with no one, whatever she has done. But they came quiet, and they did not touch me the way I had seen them touch Barbara, with that easy, familiar tenderness. They kept a small distance, as though my refusal were something that might catch. Fanny stood at the foot of the bed with her arms folded, watching, and I understood she had come less to help than to see. To see whether the woman who would not promise silence would prove, in her pain, exactly why the promise was needed. I will not tell you the whole of that night, the private hours of it, because they belong to me, and always will. I will tell you only the thing that mattered. When the pain rose past anything I had words for, I did the one thing I had refused to promise never to do. I asked for help, out loud. I asked for a cool cloth, and I asked for a hand to hold, and I asked, when the fear got its worst, whether we ought not send to town for the doctor after all. My voice was not silent. It filled that room, and I braced myself, in the middle of everything, for the sky to fall, for God to turn away, for the punishment I had been promised my whole life would come to women who made a sound. The sky did not fall. That is the plain and holy truth of it, I asked, and I was still there, and the child still came, and God did not strike me down for the sound of my own voice and my own pain. The thing I had been most afraid of turned out to be nothing but a story, told so long and so often that everyone had forgotten it was ever only a story. My asking did not break the world. It only broke the silence, and in the breaking I felt something come loose in my chest that had been bound so long I had thought it was part of me. And then a strange thing happened, in the deepest hour. Esther, the young mother who had lifted her head and said nothing, crossed the room. She took my hand without a word, against Fanny's stare, and she held it through the last of it. She wiped my face. She told me I was doing well, that I should make whatever sound I needed to make, that she was not going anywhere. She had wanted to speak for me once, and had been afraid. Now, in that room, with no one able to stop her without shaming themselves, She said it all with her 2 hands. I have never forgotten it. A promise broken by one woman had given another woman the room to break hers. My daughter was born just before dawn, as the rain thinned to a gray drizzle, and the first light came grudging through the window. They laid her on my chest, and she was warm and furious, and entirely alive, and she was mine, born to a mother who had kept her own voice through the whole of it. I looked down at her small red face, and I made her a promise then, silently, the only vow I have ever truly meant. I promised she would never sit in a middle chair and be asked to give away her yes before she was allowed to know its cost. Whatever it took, I would break that wall down 1 hand's width, so she would be born into a little more room than I was. The cost was real, and I will not pretend it away. For a long season the warmth of the valley stayed turned from me. There were suppers I was not asked to. There were women who spoke to me only when they had to. My marriage had to walk through a hard country before it found its way to level ground. Because Levi had to learn to see me as I now saw myself. And that is slow work for any man raised the way he was. But he did learn. Not all at once, and not easily. But the day he first held our daughter and I, saw fear cross his face, at the thought of anyone doing to her what they had tried to do to me. That was the day I knew we would find our way. I have come to believe the promise was never about God at all. God does not need a frightened woman's silence. The promise was a way to keep women quiet, passed down mother to daughter for so many years, that everyone had lost the thread of who first tied the knot. Verna was right. It had hardened over time. A blessing curdled slowly into a binding, and if it could harden, then it could soften again, one refusal at a time. If you are listening to this, and you were ever handed a promise before you were allowed to read it, asked to agree to your own smallness and call it faith, I want you to know that the sound you were afraid to make was never the sin. The silence was, and you were never wrong to want your own voice back. You are not wrong now,